To the webinar, Navigating Geopolitics, Technology, and Policy, the Lux Policy Compass for Industrial Companies. My name is Tiffany Hua, analyst here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague Ian Reinhardt, Associate Research Director here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question doesn't get answered today, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. Now let's jump into the presentation. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Tiffany. I'd like to start with a quick story about shipping. The International Maritime Organization, IMO, went through years of consensus building to develop a plan to gradually decarbonize the maritime shipping industry. The IMO Net Zero Framework is the first and only to combine mandatory emissions limits and a carbon price across an entire sector worldwide. The plan would reduce emissions of international shipping 20% by 2030, 70% by 2040, and aim for net zero in 2050. This is emblematic of the transition ahead for heavy industry, and it represents a big shift in the related value chains. New energy inputs, new equipment, components. It may even lead to new forms of ships. There's a real market opportunity here. Now, this was heading for passage at the October IMO meeting, but the Trump administration got wind of this and decided that this was a bad idea. Trump said on Truth Social, "The United States will not stand for this global green new scam tax on shipping," and intensified lobbying efforts in tandem with like-minded countries such as Saudi Arabia and Russia, and together convinced the majority of IMO members to delay it. At the October meeting, they voted to come back in a year to decide the fate of the net zero framework. Well, this intense lobbying was, in the words of the Secretary General, not the normal IMO meeting. Yes, these are turbulent times. So how do you prepare to leverage policy for new business initiatives without getting caught out? In the webinar today, first I'll explain the context. What was the genesis of the Lux Policy Compass? What were we thinking of and aiming for when we created it? Then I'll explain how it works, the methodology, how to interpret it. Then we'll walk through three major trends in the industrial sector and what we can learn from those. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with conclusions and key takeaways. So for the innovation function, I think we can broadly give kind of two caricatures of how groups think about policy in their innovation strategy. There's one that's a kind of compliance, check the box attitude. Are we doing anything illegal? Is there excessive liability exposure? No? Okay, legal says it's fine. Great. Now, that's okay. It's important to do that. You definitely should make sure you're operating legally, but is that enough? On the other end of the spectrum, you might think about an attitude where an important new policy provides some incentive that we say, okay, this is going to make the project profitable. It provides credits or subsidies that justify investment and further development of a technology. Your project is anchored on a policy, like in California, the Advanced Clean Trucks or Clean Fleets Act justify this investment in electrification of heavy-duty transit. Well, both of these really lack the sophistication to appropriately gauge risk and make the most of new opportunities. They're also very narrow views on the policies that directly impact your company. At Lux, we discourage our clients from making technology roadmaps, not because technology isn't important, but because it's ultimately only one factor among several that you need to incorporate in a decision to scale up first-of-a-kind FOAK technologies. And policy isn't a factor by itself, but it shapes all of these non-tech factors like market organization and adoption readiness. But you won't get there with those simplistic approaches that I described earlier. You need a better framework. The policy compass that we've developed is complementary to a holistic, multi-layered approach to innovation. Okay, enough build-up. What are we talking about? How does it work? Here on the right is an example chart of what the policy compass could look like. It's relatively simple, it's designed to be intuitive, and yet there's a lot happening under the surface. So each dot you see here, each of the green dots, would represent a single policy, regulation, or initiative, perhaps a package that's tightly integrated. And those are plotted on the two axes here. On the vertical axis, that's business impact. This is a measure of the absolute change to the economy in those relevant value chains. So it's not saying, well, this is a good policy or bad policy, but how much churn will there be? How much do companies need to adjust? How much will things change? And that's by measuring 6 key stages, thinking about the input, so the raw materials or energy sources, the process, usually a manufacturing process or perhaps power generation, the product, what is the form of the product? How is it sold? Partnerships, do you need to end a partnership because it's cut off for political reasons, or does it open avenues to new types of consortiums? Demand, does the policy change the price structure or access to certain goods and services? And then incentives, these would be any subsidies or grants, credits that the policy provides. So all taken together, these are all integrated into a single score of the total business impact. That's the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, policy likelihood. This is relatively straightforward, thinking about how likely is this policy to be enacted and enforced. So is it aligned with the ruling government? Is there strong stakeholder or social support or opposition? What is the legislative status, if that's relevant? And are there the right agencies to enforce it and the will to enforce it? Lastly, the compass needle itself. That's a little bit more subjective. It indicates the main message for the chart. It's not necessarily a line of best fit. It's trying to indicate what have we learned from this analysis and sending a signal. You also no doubt noticed the 4 quadrants. We've labeled each of these kind of like a bumper sticker of how to think about the policies in each quadrant. So on the bottom left, there's minimal impact, both low likelihood, and even if these policies were to come to pass, also low impact. Top left, in many ways, the most interesting quadrant, that's evolving. These policies have a relatively low likelihood. There's a lot of uncertainty here, but if they are carried forward, then we also expect a lot of impact. So we need to be watching, monitoring, and preparing strategy to adjust. Bottom right, manageable. There's much more certainty here. We can see these coming with a certain degree of trust and reliability, but ultimately it's an impact that businesses can easily adjust to. Then in the top right, the disruptive quadrant. These are the policies that are probably already making headlines in many ways and you're aware of, but nonetheless extremely important, can also be more of an anchor to build towards, or can be a part of a stronger justification for investment. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's look at some specific examples of really important themes or even priorities for industrial companies and what we can learn from 3 of these big themes. The first is decarbonizing operations. Very important to countries worldwide, and I'll point out a few examples from this chart here. In Canada, around and even after the recent election, there's been discussion of a potential carbon border adjustment mechanism along the lines of what the EU has. And in the EU, there's a new carbon credit framework that formalizes what's acceptable to be counted as carbon offsets. In China, the latest 5-year plan was recently outlined and rolled out, and we're expecting larger impacts from that. You can see here several examples, and this is what they look like plotted on the compass. Now, when it comes to decarbonizing, there has been a lot of volatility in regulatory support, and a lot of climate tech projects are struggling because, as I mentioned, depending on a policy to succeed is problematic. A couple policies I would highlight here. The London Metals Exchange has a new program called the Passport that, instead of a single price for a commodity like copper or nickel, it introduces tiered pricing, giving a green premium to production that has been more sustainable. This will have ripple effects both upstream and downstream. California's Advanced Clean Trucks Act promotes zero-emissions heavy-duty vehicles, but now it's in limbo as the Trump administration seeks to roll back this type of policy. You can be thinking about, well, I don't want to rely on this policy. On the other hand, if there is more certainty, and if, in the case of California, able to win court cases and the Trump administration winds down its opposition, well, that could represent a tipping point in the market where there's a fundamental shift of the balance between competing technologies. Progress and consolidation of the policy marks that point where new technology becomes much more competitive, and then it's time to double down on your innovation activity. Okay, moving to the next priority, resource security and circularity. Very much of the moment these days and top of mind for many policymakers and leaders. For example, last year we had the US-Ukraine critical minerals deal, still under discussion. It's only an MOU right now, but it could reshape the landscape in that part of the world and also for US in terms of mineral access. China's effort, on the other hand, to restrict critical mineral exports has been very impactful and essentially was the winning play in the trade dispute between US and China earlier last year. And in South America, Brazil is developing a national bioeconomy strategy to create resilience and reduce dependence on petrochemical inputs. Now, as tension and conflict escalates around the world, deglobalization creates openings for new technology. That could be recycling, like rare earth elements, or ways to extract domestic natural resources more sustainably, for example, direct lithium extraction. On the other hand, the timeline for greenfield projects is long. Could be 15 years to open a new mine. So the private sector is rightly doubtful that these policies will endure long enough to depend on. It's better to find the near-term wins that match the current moment. Policy that I'd like to highlight here is deep sea mining. There have been a push both at the international level through the International Seabed Authority, as well as in the United States to open up commercial exploitation. This is very dynamic, also questionable, probably even problematic for the undersea environment, but undeniably it represents a major new economic activity. It's a risky bet, but there's a big payoff. And it's not the type of opportunity that's going to linger around. As I mentioned, there could be pushback or rollback. So it's important to be prepared to seize that opportunity when it arises, if that's the type of high-risk bet your company wants to make. Great, moving to the third trend. And I should emphasize, these are not exhaustive. These are three of the key patterns that I wanted to highlight here for the industrial sector. This is enabling the energy transition. It's about the core industrial activity to manufacture equipment, components, materials, infrastructure that's necessary for the energy transition. I'll highlight the Clean Industrial Deal in the EU, a Future Made in Australia initiative looking to modernize that economy for sectors of the future, and even proposals for Australia to deploy civilian nuclear power, although that remains unpopular at the moment. So here, looking at the compass, we see an even broader range in policy likelihood, indicating more uncertainty in this area. But you can't wait for certainty because these technologies do require years of R&D. You need to develop either an adaptable platform technology or else invest in a diverse portfolio of projects that account for various scenarios. For example, the signature executive order that lays out Trump's energy policy reversed much of what Biden had been building toward and pivoted hard to fossil fuels, with a somewhat unexpected boost to nuclear power too. In South Korea, a major industrial accident inspired stricter regulations for EV battery safety, pushing that value chain to make adaptations and adopt safer components and battery chemistries. To seize that moment, you need to have products that are able to hit the market quickly. A fast follower strategy just won't work. Okay, I'd like to next review a few conclusions that derive from the underlying analysis, not simply the location of the dots. Across the industrial sector, innovators face several common challenges from policy and regulation. Policymakers are not trying to make change through market demand. When we do the breakdown of business impact, we see that the score is relatively low across the board, especially compared to years past. And what's really standing out is that input score. Most of the policy levers and mechanisms are about inputs, those raw materials and energy sources, either constraining where they can be obtained or encouraging new sources. And of course, resource security is a central motivation. And the message here is you need to be looking upstream to understand how these policies are affecting your suppliers, because in many cases, that's where the effects are coming from. Next, I'll call out that policymakers will sometimes define a selected technology as the preferred outcome. This is unwise and a trap for the private sector. If you go forward and develop a technology that is only competitive because of regulatory support, once that crutch is pulled away, you're in trouble. Lux has looked at sustainable aviation fuel quite closely, and one example would be Europe's favoritism for eSAF. That's likely to be unprofitable in the long term, and we think there are better options. And then finally, in this section, tipping points. I talked about that earlier. Trying to line up your R&D and scale up efforts to coincide with policy change is nearly impossible. For project development, it's much better to consider the mix of factors that I mentioned earlier, like market adoption. But when there's meaningful change that tips a market, maybe it's the IMO net zero framework coming into force, which would provide a tailwind for low carbon methanol and biofuels in shipping. That's a signal to double down on the leading technologies and advance those projects. So in conclusion, I'd like to leave you with 3 takeaways from this webinar. First, you need to get outside your 4 walls. You simply won't be able to understand the policy impacts that are coming your way by only looking at the direct connections to your company. You need to be looking both upstream and downstream. And that's why the creation of a policy compass can help you to do that. Tailoring it to your particular industry and tailoring it to the components and systems that you're developing will help you see how your demand is changing and how your suppliers are changing. Second, we recommend flexible, adaptive innovation approaches. In particular, I called out platform and portfolio as being good options that allow you to create a flexible technology roadmap while limiting sunk costs. Then lastly, deglobalization. This is the megatrend of the late 2020s. To understand how that impacts your innovation strategy, see where the policy compass is identifying opportunities to take advantage in your home market, where you can be that national champion. And then abroad, are there ways that you can mitigate risk by localizing foreign ventures, forming joint ventures, and tying up with strong national partners that allow you to hedge against that element of nationalism. Okay, that's what I wanted to share today, and thank you so much for your attention. I think now we should have time for questions.
Thanks, Ian. Great, so now we'll be taking questions from the audience. So just a reminder, if you have a question, you can type it in the questions box. If we don't get to your question on the call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. Just remember to address us at questions@luxresearchinc.com. I have a question, while we wait for some folks to type in the chat box. So you mentioned that we can tailor the compass. So I know that I wrote one for the chemicals industry. Recently, we had one on medical devices and diagnostics. So can you tell us a little bit more about how to make a custom compass and, how do we customize that?
Yeah, I will do. Thanks, Tiff. I appreciate that. I slipped it in at the end there, but I ought to have emphasized that a little bit more, explaining through the methodology phase. This is a very adaptable tool. You saw the policies that I had plotted. I wanted to get a sense of what are the most relevant, stimulating, perhaps unnoticed policies that are changing the industrial sector. And so we have a representative spread from many continents and many markets. But those are the ones that I had analyzed in order to understand how the big trends are shifting and what we can take away from that. For you, at your own desk, it's a blank canvas. So if you want to understand what are the key policies, for example, for low carbon iron and steel, well, great. You'll be able to plot those using the same framework, measuring the business impacts, thinking about policy likelihood, and then studying that compass will help you to understand some paths forward that integrate with, as I mentioned, market adoption and other factors. So it could be a particular theme or system. It could be a specific product like sodium ion batteries. You can construct a policy compass for that, and plotting out the policies to watch, policies that can be disruptive, and ones where you feel like this is more manageable. And that's a really nice chart to help you navigate the sector. And when your bosses are asking, what do we think about this? Well, you've got a systematic way of approaching it.
Great. Yeah, and we also have rubrics. So, if you need help, we can also get you started with how
Yeah,
we,
absolutely. Happy
developed the methodology internally.
to provide that and
Um,
discuss more. Thanks.
yeah, and so a question here from the audience. So, how do you determine when a policy creates a tipping point, which refers to, a point in your presentation?
Right, right. Yeah, I realize that it may be a little ambiguous, and perhaps that's simply how it is. But what I mean is, when there's an emerging topic where there are competing technologies. So take water electrolysis for green hydrogen. There are several different types of electrolyzers, PEM, alkaline electrolyzers, solid oxide electrolyzers, and so on. And there are many companies developing these ultimate green hydrogen. So what are the tipping points that will start to identify winners and losers within that category? Or it may be a system level um, impact. I'm thinking of vehicle electrification and fast charging versus battery swapping. Lux recently did an in-depth report on that. So, these are clear alternatives here. Either you're going to charge up your car very quickly, or you'll just swap the battery out. These are likely to be the dominant forms of powering up in the future. So, as those two are competing in the marketplace, would there be a policy that, for example, requires standardization of batteries so that they have to be swappable? Well, that could be the tipping point that moves the whole ecosystem in that direction, and creates a kind of flywheel effect where the more dominant one approach becomes, the harder it is to succeed with the other one. So as you're competing and developing new innovative projects, you may see that the policy suddenly shifts the ecosystem clearly in one direction or the other. And that's when that's where you really can start to have more certainty and base your long-term decisions around that, because it's created that tipping point. I hope that explains it clearly enough.
No, that makes sense. Great. And so just in the interest of time, that will conclude our webinar for today. Just as a reminder to the audience, the slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. And after leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We'd really appreciate any feedback you'd have to inform and improve future webinars. And also take a moment to check out our upcoming webinars on our website, and appreciate you joining us, and have a great day.